This episode is brought to you by Hill's Pet Nutrition. Every shelter pet deserves a second chance, and you're making it possible for thousands of them every day. Because when you feed your pet Hill's, you help feed a shelter pet, which helps make them healthy, happy, and more adoptable, changing their life forever. So they can change yours. Over 15 million shelter pets fed and adopted. Science did that. Visit hillspet.com/podcast to learn more.
Auto insurance can all seem the same until it comes time to use it. So don't get stuck paying more for less coverage. Switch to USAA Auto Insurance and you could start saving money in no time. Get a quote today. Restrictions apply.
USAA. Welcome to Conspiracy Files, where every week we break down the world's most intriguing conspiracy theories. If you'd like to listen to previous episodes, you can find them on your favorite podcast directory or on our website at theconspiracyfilespodcast.com. Let's dive in. The Federal Reserve has long been the subject of conspiracy theories, with critics and theorists questioning its origins, purpose, and ultimate control. At the heart of these theories is the belief that the Federal Reserve is not truly a government institution, but rather a private banking cartel that holds immense power over the United States and global economies. Many point to its creation in 1913 as a key turning point in American history, marking the moment when the nation's financial sovereignty was allegedly handed over to a small group of elites. Conspiracy theorists often trace the origins of the Federal Reserve to a secretive meeting held in 1910 on Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia. According to accounts, this gathering included some of the most powerful bankers and financial figures of the time, such as representatives from J.P. Morgan, the Rockefeller family, and European banking dynasties like the Rothschilds. The purpose of the meeting was to draft a plan for a central banking system that would ultimately become the Federal Reserve. For conspiracy theorists, the clandestine nature of this meeting is proof of a hidden agenda, with a few elite families working to consolidate their control over the American economy. One of the most enduring claims about the Federal Reserve is that it operates independently of the U.S. government, despite its significant influence on monetary policy. The Federal Reserve is structured in a way that gives it autonomy, with private banks owning shares in the regional Federal Reserve banks and profiting from their operations. Critics argue that this system prioritizes the interests of bankers and private shareholders over those of the public. This perception is bolstered by the fact that the Federal Reserve's decision-making process is not directly accountable to voters or elected officials, leaving its actions shrouded in secrecy. A major point of contention among conspiracy theorists is the Federal Reserve's control over the creation of money. The Federal Reserve has the authority to issue currency and adjust the money supply, which conspiracy theorists argue gives it unparalleled power to manipulate economies and governments. Critics claim that by controlling the flow of money, the Federal Reserve can create economic booms and busts at will, enriching its private shareholders while leaving ordinary citizens to bear the brunt of financial crises. Historical events like the Great Depression and the 2008 financial crisis are often cited as examples of how the Federal Reserve's policies have allegedly been used to destabilize economies for the benefit of a select few. The role of debt in the Federal Reserve System is another focal point for conspiracy theories. Many argue that the Federal Reserve perpetuates a system of perpetual debt by issuing money as loans that must be repaid with interest. This system, theorists claim, ensures that the nation's debt can never be fully repaid, effectively enslaving the government and its citizens to the banking system. The national debt, which has ballooned to trillions of dollars, is seen as evidence of this strategy. Critics contend that this debt-based system benefits the elites who profit from interest payments, while burdening future generations with insurmountable liabilities. Some theorists go further, claiming that the Federal Reserve is part of a global conspiracy aimed at establishing a new world order. According to this narrative, the Federal Reserve is a key player in a broader scheme to centralize power and wealth in the hands of a global elite. Proponents of this theory often link the Federal Reserve to other institutions, such as the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank, which they believe are working together to create a unified global financial system. The ultimate goal, according to this perspective, is to establish a world government controlled by a small, unelected elite. Evidence often cited in support of these claims includes statements from prominent historical figures who warned against the dangers of central banking. For example, Thomas Jefferson famously expressed his opposition to central banks, warning that they posed a greater threat to liberty than standing armies. Similarly, President Woodrow Wilson, who signed the Federal Reserve Act into law, is often quoted as regretting his decision, allegedly stating that he had unwittingly ruined his country. Although the authenticity of some of these quotes is debated, they remain central to the conspiracy narrative. A recurring theme in Federal Reserve conspiracy theories is the idea that the institution's true beneficiaries are a shadowy cabal of international bankers. The Rothschild family, in particular, is frequently named in these theories, with claims that they have exerted control over central banks worldwide for centuries. Proponents of this narrative argue that the Rothschilds and their allies use institutions like the Federal Reserve to manipulate global events, from wars to economic recessions, in order to maintain their dominance. While concrete evidence of this alleged control is scarce, the enduring mystique of the Rothschilds fuels these beliefs. The secrecy surrounding the Federal Reserve's operations also adds to its mystique and feeds conspiracy theories. Unlike other government agencies, the Federal Reserve is not subject to the same level of transparency, and its meetings and decision-making processes are often conducted behind closed doors. This lack of openness has led to suspicions that the institution is hiding its true intentions. Efforts to audit the Federal Reserve have been met with resistance, further fueling speculation about what might be uncovered if its inner workings were fully exposed. Ultimately, conspiracy theorists see the Federal Reserve as more than just a financial institution. They view it as a symbol of a broader struggle between ordinary citizens and an elite class that seeks to dominate the world's resources. The Federal Reserve's influence over the economy, its connections to powerful families, and its secretive nature all serve as fodder for those who believe that its true purpose is far more sinister than it appears. For these theorists, understanding and exposing the Federal Reserve's alleged agenda is essential to reclaiming control over the nation's financial future. Another compelling dimension of Federal Reserve conspiracy theories revolves around its alleged role in orchestrating major historical events to serve the interests of powerful elites. Proponents of this perspective argue that the Federal Reserve has been instrumental in engineering wars, economic collapses, and political upheavals to consolidate power and wealth. Central to this theory is the belief that by controlling the flow of money, the Federal Reserve manipulates circumstances that compel governments to act in ways that benefit the banking establishment, often at the expense of national sovereignty and individual freedoms. One of the most cited examples is the claim that the Federal Reserve played a role in financing both sides of major conflicts, such as World War I and World War II. Conspiracy theorists allege that the financial system, under the influence of central banks, profited immensely from wartime lending. Loans were extended to governments and industries involved in the war effort, ensuring that interest payments flowed into the coffers of banking elites, regardless of the outcome. The Rothschild family and other prominent banking dynasties are frequently implicated in this narrative, accused of using their influence over central banks, including the Federal Reserve, to profit from human suffering and geopolitical chaos. Another alleged example of the Federal Reserve's manipulation involves the Great Depression. Conspiracy theorists claim that the Federal Reserve deliberately tightened monetary policy in the years leading up to the stock market crash of 1929, knowing it would trigger a severe economic downturn. The subsequent collapse allowed banking elites to buy up assets and properties at bargain prices, while ordinary citizens lost their savings and livelihoods. This theory is bolstered by the fact that several contemporary critics, including Congressman Louis T. McFadden, accused the Federal Reserve of engineering the Depression to consolidate wealth and power. The Federal Reserve's role during the 2008 financial crisis also fuels conspiracy theories. Critics argue that the Federal Reserve's policies leading up to the crisis, such as keeping interest rates artificially low and enabling risky financial practices, contributed to the housing bubble's collapse. When the crisis hit, the Federal Reserve orchestrated massive bailouts for major financial institutions, many of which had ties to the Federal Reserve itself. Conspiracy theorists view this as evidence that the Federal Reserve prioritizes protecting the interests of the banking elite over the well-being of ordinary citizens. The secrecy surrounding the exact details of these bailouts further amplifies suspicions of corruption and collusion. A more speculative angle involves the idea that the Federal Reserve and other central banks are laying the groundwork for a cashless society as part of a broader agenda for global control. Proponents of this theory argue that the increasing digitization of money, coupled with centralized financial systems, enables an unprecedented level of surveillance and control over individuals. By eliminating physical currency, central banks could theoretically track every transaction, restrict access to funds, or impose negative interest rates to force spending. The Federal Reserve's exploration of digital currency is often cited as a step toward this dystopian future. Adding to these suspicions is the belief that the Federal Reserve's influence extends beyond economics into the realm of politics. Conspiracy theorists claim that the Federal Reserve exerts control over elected officials through campaign financing, lobbying, and policy influence. By ensuring that candidates favorable to its agenda gain political power, the Federal Reserve allegedly maintains its grip on monetary policy and shields itself from scrutiny. High-profile figures who have challenged the Federal Reserve, such as former Congressman Ron Paul, are often portrayed as lone voices in a system designed to suppress dissent. The secrecy surrounding the Federal Reserve's gold reserves is another focal point for conspiracy theories. While the Federal Reserve claims to hold significant gold reserves in locations such as Fort Knox and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, these holdings have not been fully audited in decades. This lack of transparency has led to speculation that the gold has been misappropriated or used to back private financial interests. Some theorists even claim that the gold reserves are no longer in these vaults at all, further fueling distrust in the Federal Reserve's operations. A recurring theme in these theories is the idea that the Federal Reserve represents the interests of a transnational elite rather than the American people. Its connections to other central banks and institutions, such as the Bank for International Settlements, BIS, are often cited as evidence of a coordinated effort to control the global economy. The BIS, sometimes referred to as the Central Bank of Central Banks, is accused of facilitating collusion between central banks, including the Federal Reserve, to implement policies that benefit financial elites while undermining national sovereignty. The idea that the Federal Reserve operates as part of a shadow government or deep state is also a significant element of these theories. This narrative suggests that the Federal Reserve is a key tool used by hidden power structures to control governments and shape global events. Theories often highlight the revolving door between the Federal Reserve and private financial institutions, suggesting that this overlap allows elites to blur the lines between public and private interests. In sum, these conspiracy theories portray the Federal Reserve not as a neutral arbiter of monetary policy, but as a powerful institution wielding immense influence over global events. Through war, economic crises, and political manipulation, the Federal Reserve is alleged to serve the interests of an elite few while masking its true agenda behind a facade of public service. These claims, while speculative and lacking mainstream acceptance, remain a cornerstone of the broader critique of centralized financial power. Another perspective within Federal Reserve conspiracy theories delves into its alleged role in manipulating inflation, deflation, and economic cycles to serve the interests of financial elites. Proponents of these theories argue that the Federal Reserve's control over monetary policy allows it to orchestrate economic conditions that maximize profits for a select few while destabilizing the financial well-being of the general population. This manipulation is seen as deliberate, with long-term goals of consolidating wealth and reducing middle-class economic mobility. A central argument is that the Federal Reserve creates boom and bust cycles intentionally. Critics claim that by setting interest rates and influencing the money supply, the Federal Reserve can artificially inflate markets, encouraging speculative bubbles. Once these bubbles reach their peak, theorists allege, the Federal Reserve tightens monetary policy, causing a market collapse. During these downturns, assets like real estate, stocks, and businesses often become undervalued, enabling elite investors and banks to acquire them at bargain prices. The repeated occurrence of such cycles is seen as evidence of systemic manipulation rather than natural market behavior. The inflationary policies of the Federal Reserve are another focal point. Conspiracy theorists argue that the gradual erosion of purchasing power caused by inflation disproportionately harms ordinary citizens while benefiting banks and wealthy investors. Inflation reduces the value of savings and fixed incomes, making it harder for average individuals to build or maintain wealth. Simultaneously, inflation enables borrowers, especially large institutions, to repay loans with money that is worth less than when it was borrowed. The Federal Reserve's consistent inflationary policies are interpreted as a deliberate wealth transfer mechanism favoring debt-holding elites over the savings-dependent public. One of the most cited pieces of evidence supporting this view is the dramatic devaluation of the US dollar since the Federal Reserve's inception in 1913. Over the past century, the dollar's purchasing power has declined by more than 95%, a fact often attributed to Federal Reserve policies. This decline is seen by theorists as a method of creating perpetual dependency on credit, as citizens are compelled to borrow in order to maintain their standard of living in an environment where saving becomes increasingly futile. Debt is another key aspect of these theories, with the Federal Reserve's role in the national debt often highlighted as a mechanism of control. Conspiracy theorists argue that by creating money through debt, the Federal Reserve ensures that the U.S. government remains perpetually indebted to the banking system. The issuance of Treasury bonds to fund government spending is seen as a cycle of dependency, where the Federal Reserve and its private shareholders profit from interest payments made by taxpayers. The increasing national debt, which now exceeds $30 trillion, is viewed as a tool to weaken national sovereignty and force compliance with the agendas of financial elites. The concept of quantitative easing, QE, a policy used extensively by the Federal Reserve during economic crises, is also scrutinized by conspiracy theorists. QE involves the Federal Reserve purchasing government bonds and other securities to inject liquidity into the economy. Critics claim this policy primarily benefits Wall Street and large corporations rather than Main Street. By artificially inflating asset prices, QE allegedly enriches those who own significant investments, such as stocks and real estate, while providing little relief to ordinary workers and small businesses. The disparity in benefits is seen as evidence of the Federal Reserve's allegiance to the wealthy. The potential for economic manipulation extends beyond US dollar borders in these theories. The Federal Reserve's role in controlling the global reserve currency, the US dollar, is portrayed as a means of exerting international influence. Many theorists believe that countries that attempt to challenge the dollar's dominance, such as by adopting alternative currencies or gold-backed systems, face economic retaliation orchestrated by the Federal Reserve and its allies. High-profile examples include the fates of nations like Iraq and Libya, whose leaders advocated for abandoning the dollar in favor of other systems. The subsequent military interventions and economic sanctions against these countries are interpreted as efforts to preserve the Federal Reserve's global hegemony. Another controversial aspect involves the Federal Reserve's alleged collaboration with multinational corporations to influence labor markets and wages. By adjusting monetary policy, the Federal Reserve can indirectly affect unemployment rates and wage growth. Conspiracy theorists argue that suppressing wages benefits corporations by increasing profit margins, creating a labor force that remains dependent on debt to meet basic needs. This perceived collusion between the Federal Reserve and corporate elites is seen as part of a broader strategy to maintain economic control over the population. Theorists also point to the Federal Reserve's lack of direct accountability as a critical factor enabling these manipulative practices. Unlike government agencies subject to public oversight, the Federal Reserve operates with significant autonomy. Its leaders are not elected, and its decision-making processes often occur behind closed doors. This independence is interpreted as a deliberate design to shield the institution from scrutiny while allowing it to implement policies that align with elite interests. Supporters of these theories view the Federal Reserve as not merely a financial entity, but as a central player in a larger framework of economic control. By manipulating inflation, debt, and market cycles, the Federal Reserve allegedly ensures the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a small, interconnected elite. For conspiracy theorists, exposing and dismantling this system is seen as essential to restoring economic justice and sovereignty. These claims continue to resonate among critics who believe the Federal Reserve's influence extends far beyond its publicly stated mission. Another compelling thread within Federal Reserve conspiracy theories delves into the secretive origins of its structure and the alleged concealment of its true ownership and control. According to this narrative, the Federal Reserve was intentionally designed to mislead the public into believing it operates as a government entity, when in fact, it serves private banking interests that remain hidden from scrutiny. This secrecy is often cited as evidence of a broader agenda to manipulate monetary systems globally. A key focus is the clandestine meeting held in 1910 on Jekyll Island, Georgia, where a small group of bankers and financiers allegedly devised the framework for what would become the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. The participants, including influential figures like Paul Warburg, Frank Vanderlip, and representatives of the Rockefeller and Morgan banking empires, are often described as conspiring to create a central bank that would benefit their private interests while appearing to serve the public good. Conspiracy theorists emphasize the secrecy of this meeting, noting that the attendees used pseudonyms and avoided public attention, a fact acknowledged even in some mainstream historical accounts. This covert nature, they argue, points to the Federal Reserve's true purpose as a tool for financial elites.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed's sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
The question of ownership is another central theme. While the Federal Reserve is officially described as an independent central bank with a public-private structure, theorists argue that its actual control lies entirely in the hands of private banking families. They often point to the Federal Reserve's 12 regional banks, which are technically owned by member banks in their respective districts. This ownership model is portrayed as evidence that the Federal Reserve prioritizes the interests of private bankers over those of the American people. Theorists further allege that the true beneficiaries of the Federal Reserve's policies are not even confined to U.S. borders. They claim that international banking dynasties, such as the Rothschilds, wield significant influence over the Federal Reserve. This narrative suggests that these families, through their historical ties to central banking, maintain a controlling interest in the Federal Reserve's operations, leveraging it to further their global financial dominance. The lack of transparency about the identities of the Federal Reserve's ultimate stakeholders is often cited as a deliberate effort to obscure this influence. Another aspect of this theory involves the Federal Reserve's profit-making mechanisms. While the Federal Reserve returns its profits to the U.S. Treasury after covering its expenses, conspiracy theorists argue that the process lacks sufficient transparency. They contend that significant profits are funneled to private shareholders through undisclosed channels, enriching the banking elite under the guise of public service. The high interest payments on the U.S. national debt, much of which is attributed to the Federal Reserve's policies, are seen as a continuous transfer of wealth from taxpayers to these hidden beneficiaries. The role of secrecy in the Federal Reserve's decision-making process is also a significant point of contention. The Federal Open Market Committee, FOMC, which determines monetary policy, holds meetings that are closed to the public, with only partial minutes released weeks later. Conspiracy theorists argue that this lack of real-time transparency enables the Federal Reserve to enact policies that serve private interests without accountability. They often highlight the close ties between Federal Reserve officials and major financial institutions, suggesting a revolving door that perpetuates this system of concealed influence. Adding to these claims is the argument that the Federal Reserve's design allows it to operate with minimal oversight from Congress or the president. Its independence from direct political control is framed by theorists as a shield for its true masters, private banking interests. The fact that the Federal Reserve's books have never been fully audited reinforces suspicions about the potential concealment of its financial dealings and relationships. A particularly provocative claim is that the Federal Reserve was intentionally created during a period of distraction and political maneuvering. Conspiracy theorists note that the Federal Reserve Act was passed on December 23, 1913, just before Christmas, when many members of Congress were absent. This timing is viewed as a strategic move to minimize opposition and ensure the bill's passage without significant public debate. The Federal Reserve Act's complex language is also interpreted as a deliberate attempt to obscure its true implications from both lawmakers and the public. The connection between the Federal Reserve and the global banking system is further scrutinized in theories suggesting it operates as part of a coordinated effort to implement centralized financial control worldwide. This is often tied to the Bank for International Settlements, BIS, which conspiracy theorists describe as a hub for international financial elites. They claim that the Federal Reserve, as a key player in this network, collaborates with other central banks to maintain a system that benefits a transnational elite. Finally, theorists highlight the symbolism of the Federal Reserve's headquarters in Washington, D.C., as a representation of hidden power. The architecture and location of the Federal Reserve Building are sometimes interpreted as reflecting Masonic or occult influences, tying it to a broader narrative of secret societies and hidden agendas. These symbolic interpretations, while speculative, resonate with those who view the Federal Reserve as an institution shrouded in mystery and designed to serve purposes far removed from its official mandate. These theories about the Federal Reserve's origins, ownership, and secrecy present a deeply critical view of the institution, suggesting it was established to serve elite interests through manipulation and concealment. Whether through its alleged private ownership, ties to international banking families, or secretive operations, the Federal Reserve remains a focal point for those who believe it plays a central role in a global system of hidden control. Building upon the notion of concealed motives and hidden control, another prominent conspiracy theory surrounding the Federal Reserve posits that it is actively working to dismantle national sovereignty and replace it with a global financial system governed by an unelected elite. This narrative ties the Federal Reserve to efforts to create a centralized global currency and banking system, allegedly as part of a larger plan to implement a new world order. Advocates of this theory argue that the Federal Reserve plays a pivotal role in advancing this agenda by manipulating economies, debt, and currency values. One of the key components of this theory involves the Federal Reserve's connection to international monetary systems. Conspiracy theorists point to institutions like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank as instruments of this globalist agenda, with the Federal Reserve acting as a model and enabler. They argue that these organizations work in tandem to impose austerity measures, exploit developing nations, and centralize economic power. The Federal Reserve's influence in shaping global monetary policy is viewed as evidence of its alignment with these entities to erode national control over economic decisions. A specific element of this narrative is the concept of the Amero, a proposed unified currency for North America that would replace the US dollar, Canadian dollar, and Mexican peso. While no formal plans for such a currency have been acknowledged by governments, conspiracy theorists believe it is part of a gradual plan to dissolve national borders and integrate economies under a single authority. The Federal Reserve, they argue, would play a central role in facilitating this transition by destabilizing the dollar and creating conditions favorable to introducing a new currency. The introduction of digital currencies is another focal point for this theory. Many conspiracy theorists believe that the Federal Reserve's exploration of central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, is a precursor to the abolition of cash and the establishment of a fully digital economy. They argue that such a system would grant unprecedented surveillance powers to central banks, allowing them to track and control individual financial transactions. Critics suggest that a digital currency controlled by the Federal Reserve would mark the end of financial privacy and personal autonomy, enabling the centralization of economic power on a global scale. Theorists also highlight the Federal Reserve's role in the global financial crisis of 2008 as a deliberate step toward consolidating control. They argue that the crisis was engineered through reckless monetary policies and deregulation, allowing major financial institutions to profit from the collapse while smaller banks and businesses were wiped out. The Federal Reserve's subsequent bailouts of too-big-to-fail banks are interpreted as a move to consolidate power within a few key players aligned with globalist interests. This event is often viewed as a trial run for larger financial resets aimed at achieving global economic governance. Another controversial claim involves the Federal Reserve's alleged involvement in covert geopolitical operations to destabilize nations resistant to global financial integration. Conspiracy theorists argue that the Federal Reserve uses its influence over monetary policy and financial markets to pressure countries that challenge the dominance of the U.S. dollar or Western-led financial systems. Countries like Venezuela, Iran, and Russia are often cited as targets of such tactics, with sanctions, currency devaluations, and economic warfare linked back to Federal Reserve strategies. The role of black budgets and off-the-books financing is also a significant aspect of this theory. Some theorists allege that the Federal Reserve facilitates the funding of clandestine projects through untraceable financial mechanisms. This includes allegations that the Federal Reserve collaborates with intelligence agencies and multinational corporations to finance activities that advance globalist goals, ranging from technological development to military interventions. The lack of public audits or accountability for these funds fuels suspicions that the Federal Reserve is deeply enmeshed in hidden agendas. Historical precedents are often cited as supporting evidence for these claims. The theorists refer to events like the Bretton Woods Agreement, which established the U.S. dollar as the global reserve currency, as a milestone in the Federal Reserve's role in consolidating financial power. They argue that subsequent efforts to move away from the gold standard and increase reliance on fiat currencies were deliberate strategies to make national economies more vulnerable to external control, thereby paving the way for global financial unification. Another supporting argument comes from perceived efforts to weaken traditional economic safeguards, such as the dissolution of Glass-Steagall protections in the late 1990s. This deregulation, conspiracy theorists claim, was orchestrated to concentrate financial power among a few global players, setting the stage for future economic crises that could be leveraged to push globalist policies. The idea of a Great Reset, popularized in recent years, is often tied to the Federal Reserve's role in shaping a post-pandemic world order. Conspiracy theorists argue that the Federal Reserve's monetary policies during the COVID-19 pandemic, including massive money printing and stimulus programs, are deliberate steps toward an economic collapse that would justify the introduction of a new global financial system. They view the Great Reset initiative promoted by global organizations as the culmination of this agenda, with the Federal Reserve acting as a key player in executing the transition. In this view, the Federal Reserve is not merely a national institution, but a linchpin in a much larger effort to reshape global governance through financial means. By leveraging economic crises, digital currencies, and international institutions, theorists believe the Federal Reserve is systematically dismantling national sovereignty to pave the way for a centralized global order. Whether through its policies, secrecy, or alignment with transnational entities, the Federal Reserve remains a focal point for those who see it as a driver of globalist ambitions. Thanks for listening to the Conspiracy Files podcast. We're here with new episodes every Wednesday. Be sure to check us out on Instagram at the Conspiracy Files podcast. And if you're listening on Spotify, swipe up and share your thoughts or email us at contact@theconspiracyfilespodcast.com. Until next time, and remember, the truth is out there.